Well, joining me now is journalist and historian Caleb Gayle. Caleb specializes, if you will, he's written for all sorts of major news organizations. But in many ways, he specializes in what I would call hidden history, undiscovered history, or underwritten. I think discovered's the wrong word there. Underwritten history. And as you know, we love that here at the ToddCast. The most recent book he's got is called Black Moses, a saga of ambition and the fight for a black state. Caleb is from Oklahoma, spends a lot of time talking about essentially buried history, particularly among African Americans in the state of Oklahoma. And this book is about how what is now Oklahoma, what the character in this book, Black Moses, wanted to create, essentially a black state. And so Caleb joins me now. Caleb, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well, Chuck.
Look, I think this is why, I always call myself a history junkie, not a political junkie. I refer to myself more as a political anthropologist these days than a political analyst, because I do think it's sort of, when you look at it like an anthropologist, you can sometimes understand different tribes, right? What else are we going to call it? Different political tribes, ideological tribes. But this is a fascinating story, and I'd love to know more about it. But let me start with what got you into essentially becoming a history writer, a history biographer of sorts.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of journalists probably should learn a lot from anthropologists about how to do work, right?
How to be observers, right? One of our jobs is to observe, and an anthropologist, that's what they do best.
Certainly. Yes, I mean, I think that my interest in history really comes from my annoyance as a child. I was always known as the kid who just wasn't satisfied knowing that this is the way things are. I had to kind of know how we got there. And I think in part because I'm the son and grandson of Black pastors, there's always this tinge and inflection in their voice as they kind of reflect on where we have come. Mm-hmm. And so as such, my brain is just kind of hardwired, maybe even my heart spiritually, I guess, is hardwired to kind of examine how we got from point A to point B. I'm not satisfied living at point B without understanding point A. And then growing up in Oklahoma, your history is kind of stripped down to the most hagiographic parts, right? Yeah. The most jingoistic parts. And so, I mean, we can talk more about it, but I had always felt like I was missing part of the plot and being told to be satisfied with point B, as opposed to understanding how we got there.
There's a reason results matter more than promises. Just like there's a reason Morgan & Morgan has become America's largest injury law firm. For the last 35 years, they've recovered $25 billion for more than 500,000 clients. It includes cases where insurance companies offered next to nothing, short of shortchanging, seeing if they could get away with it. And Morgan & Morgan fought back, and they won millions. In Pennsylvania, one client was awarded $26 million. It was a staggering 40 times the amount that the insurance company originally offered. That offer, $650,000, whatever it took to sort of get away without paying. So with more than 1,000 lawyers across the country, Morgan & Morgan knows how to deliver for everyday people. So if you're injured, you're looking for a lawyer, check out forthepeople.com/Toddcast or dial #law, #529 on your cell phone. And remember, all law firms are not the same. So give Morgan & Morgan a look. Their fee is free unless they win.
Well, look, I feel like just in the last 15 years, I continue to hear about stories, particularly about African-American communities in the South. And you're sitting there going, why didn't we know more about this? Why wasn't I, I grew up in Florida. In Oklahoma, there's the infamous Tulsa massacre. Of course. In Florida, there's Axe Handle Sunday, which took place in Jacksonville. And here was something like, I had an entire year in middle school dedicated to Florida history. We talked about some of the Native American tribes. We talked about some of the history of Florida being part of the Confederacy and things like that. They didn't tell us about Axe Handle Sunday. And
Not a surprise.
Right. And I'm growing up a white child, right? Here you're a black child realizing I'm not being told the full history. And now you're doing something about it, which, this is, we all learn a little bit more, which then helps us explain, the story of America is not a straight line, as we all know. So let's dive into Black Moses. When did you discover this story? Tell me your discovery of this story, and then how you dug into it.
So I initially heard of Edward McCabe years and years ago when I went to undergrad at University of Oklahoma. And before I kind of jetted off to not return to Oklahoma ever again initially, as was the hope of every kid growing up in Oklahoma, I remember going to Langston, Oklahoma, which is the town that he founded, but it's also home to Langston University, the furthest west HBCU in the country. And there aren't many hotels there, even though we were there for ostensibly a party. We went to Guthrie, Oklahoma, which is right next to it. And there's this large sign in the middle of Main Street that says Edward P. McCabe. And as I read it, and kind of this exotic vision of a Black state in the United States of America, I kind of just assumed that, man, McCabe must have been a very well-meaning Irishman because of his last name, and kind of dismissed it. But I had grown up, when we moved to Oklahoma from New York, where I was born, when we moved there, I distinctly remember, again, my dissatisfaction with just living in the present without understanding how we got here. I distinctly remember we went to this place called Walmart. We had never been there before growing up in the Bronx. And I distinctly remember a family of Black folks on horseback who then pulled up to the Walmart on their horses.
Wow.
Tied it to the rail outside, did their shopping, got back on their horses, and left. And it felt to me that, even though I wasn't hearing it in my textbooks,
it sounds like a movie set. Right? You're like, because you just don't see that, especially a kid coming from New York City, right?
Exactly. And so to me, it felt as if those moments, in aggregate, and there are many more of them that I won't go into, felt as if they were kind of haunting me, especially as I was becoming more and more obsessed with history, that I had to figure out a way. I knew that somehow they were in some way connected. And then in doing my first book, I realized that there were a bunch of Black citizens of these varied indigenous nations, Cherokee, Creek, that were writing these letters about how amazing it was to be Black in Indian territory. And noticed that some of the correspondence contained the same guy that I had heard about nearly 20 years before, named Edward McCabe. And suddenly it felt like, oh goodness, there's some connective tissue between these varied experiences, like the fact that in Oklahoma, if you want to go to a real rodeo, you go to the Black rodeo. If you want to see what it's like to see people cattle ranching, well, you go to places like Taft and other places where Black people have been honing these sorts of cultural totems for so very long. And so that's when I was like, okay, there's a connection here. But then when I actually dug into who this Edward McCabe guy was and found out that he was a polarizing, relatively narcissistic dreamer, who doesn't want a book about someone who was controversial? I mean, you want a controversial figure who said a lot of things that angered and pissed off a lot of people, but then also still harbored this dream that felt quintessentially American, which is to find a place to belong.
Right.
That's when I became an obsessive for 5 years until you have what you have in front of you, which is the book.
Right. Before we get to McCabe, trace the origins of Black communities in Oklahoma and the relationship with various tribes. You throughout time you'd hear stories that there was sort of almost like, well, the white man's the enemy of these Native American tribes, and so there is in some ways shared, the enemy of my enemy is my friend type of mindset. Is that how you would describe the sort of the initial sort of acceptance of Blacks with the Native American tribes of Oklahoma?
That's a great question. To answer it as succinctly as I can, Angie Debo, this phenomenal historian who lived many, many moons ago, wrote about and discovered some of the initial work of what was known as the Coosaw tribe, which was around your parts of the country in Florida, who interacted with a bunch of Spanish explorers who also had a lot of black slaves. Those black slaves escaped, and those Coosaw adopted them into their nation. Those Coosaw eventually then became federated within what we now consider the Creek Nation, one of the largest indigenous nations in the country. Right. But the reality is that when we look at, for instance, like the Trail of Tears, a sizable percentage, sometimes people range that anywhere between roughly 10 to 12% up to like 25% of the people who were on that trail of Indian removal to actually be people of African descent. Some of whom were adopted fully as citizens, some of whom have never been slaves, some of whom were slaves from these indigenous nations. But then also that also had something to do with that wasn't the only way Black people became familiar with or migrated to Oklahoma, right? A lot of times people were entranced with the idea of going west, in part because the situation post-Reconstruction America had worsened so much that a lot of Black people escaped, and oftentimes suddenly, to Kansas, in part because Kansas was admitted as a free state. You had the legacy of John Brown. You had a significant Quaker movement that was actively organizing for educating and employing Black people. So there are myriad ways in which Black people became quite keen on settling parts of the American West.
All right, so now bring me to Mr. McCabe. How does he get to Oklahoma?
Sure. I mean, Mr. McCabe is very much unlike a lot of the people that we just talked about, right? Never enslaved, highly educated, grew up while the Civil War was raging, while Reconstruction was waxing and waning. He was getting educated all over New England. He was working as a clerk on Wall Street. He was working as a clerk to people like Potter Palmer in Chicago, who, for those of your Midwestern listeners, they'll know who that is because he was the hotel king of State Street and launched the careers of Marshall Fields, right?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And those are the people that McCabe was cavorting with. But he realized in all of those places that his ambition would be capped, right? His dreams would be limited, relegated to his station. And so initially he goes to Kansas with his best friend, A.T. Hall Jr., and when he gets to Kansas, he doesn't go to the places that are hyper-populated, Topeka, so on and so forth. He goes really far west. And having gone there on several occasions, I can tell you it is really far west. It's in a place called Nicodemus. And what quickly is initially a landing pad becomes his launching pad for power. He quickly becomes state auditor of Kansas, the very first Black statewide elected official in the Old West. And from there, we start to really see a guy who's a political tactician.
Where are we on the calendar? Is this
of course,
yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, so that makes total sense. We're in the late 1870s, early 1880s.
Got it.
In which he's ascended to power.
So Reconstruction is basically gone after the 1876 deal. And there was definitely a lot of tumults with especially in the world of Black elites in the northern part of the country.
Exactly. And so what you see is people pouring into places like Kansas, saying, we've tried Lincoln, we've tried Jackson, and quite frankly, every man is his own Moses now. Every man is his own Moses. And into this void steps people like McCabe, who isn't really offering necessarily these like heroic, very intangible, esoteric visions of what Black America can strive for. He's much more of a hard-nosed political tactician. And he runs for office multiple times, wins multiple times, and on his third opportunity, despite his sterling record on account of racism, he fails. But people, a lot of Black people, but then also very powerful U.S. senators, as we approached the mid-1880s, started to whisper in his ear that there might be an opportunity for Black people in Oklahoma, in the Oklahoma Territory. And they start pushing it. Kansas Republicans get behind him. Quite a few other Republicans from around the country get behind him. And that's when, as Oklahoma is becoming opened, again, through some really awful activities on behalf of the United States government towards indigenous nations, that's the precise opportunity that a lot of folks start to whisper and then yell loudly in McCabe's ear that this is our chance. If you can just get enough Black people to get to this state, you'll be an undeniable force where you too can become the governor of the very first Black state in the Union. And that's the argument he makes even to President Benjamin Harrison.
Well, that's interesting ambition. So what, is, I guess step one is trying to get the word out to convince Black Americans to come to Oklahoma. How does he do it?
Yeah, again, it's always good to have a main subject or character who is really narcissistic and knows no bounds to his own ambition. So he moves there. That's one. He starts up his own newspaper. He starts to leverage these immigration associations.
Where is he in Oklahoma? Where is he specifically? Is he going to Tulsa?
No, I mean, at this point, he goes to a place that's roughly about 15 miles roughly outside of Oklahoma City.
Okay.
To a place called Guthrie. And from Guthrie, he goes just a touch north to Langston, Oklahoma. And then at that point, it's not Langston. It's just a place. And he names it Langston after people he admires, John Mercer Langston, and begins to name all of the streets after the first U.S. senator to become, first Black U.S. senator to serve a full term after being elected, Blanche Bruce. He starts to kind of sell his wares before anything is built. Says that there's going to be a university. He says that the Waldorf family has given him $25,000 to start a university. He says there are going to be schools. There are no schools yet. But he also sounds
like the Music Man a little bit. Like, I'm going to build it. Here we go.
Right here in River City. Right here. And the thing is, though, is he kind of doesn't just evince, but kind of puts into practice the build and they will come.
Right.
And they did. Right. And he founds more towns and more settlements in other larger white towns that were more amenable to having Black people there. And then he also, in fact, gets appointed to become the treasurer and auditor of this new territory as well, right? So
and this is still a territory. It's not a state yet.
Correct. In fact, there are two territories at the time, right? Indian Territory to the east,
right,
and the Oklahoma Territory to the west. Okay. And he's making his pitch because he knew, like others knew, that the United States government, it was inevitable that they would combine the two into a large state. And he thought if you could just get enough Black people with 2,000 agents that he dispatches throughout the American South and North, that perhaps he can make the bid, especially because people like Benjamin Harrison didn't give him the ultimate green light that this would be his state.
So, so then what I guess I hate to just make it a simple question. So he's got this ambition, he's got this dream. Let's start with Benjamin Harrison. It's politically in his interests. It's in the interests of the Republican Party of that time to make this happen. So what's the hesitation?
So many hesitations. The reality is, and to your point for the listeners, I mean, there had been longstanding efforts to try and figure out how to deal with this quote unquote Negro problem, right? And as you'll see in the book, for those of you who pick it up, you'll go to Haiti, you'll go to Liberia, you go to Colombia, you go to southern Texas and Mexico, all in the effort to try and figure out a place. So McCabe theoretically should have been able to say, well, let me do this.
Right.
But the reality is that he was the wrong person to be asking, let me do this. I would posit, right?
Okay. What made him the wrong person? Did he just not have, well, you tell me, what made him the wrong person?
Sure. I mean, one, I think he was Black. That's one strike against him. And not to be reductive, but there had been many other attempts, and not successful ones, but ones in which people were able to convince even our most vaunted president, right, Abraham Lincoln, to write a pretty massive check to send a bunch of Black people to Haiti. But that was under the leadership of a white guy.
Right.
Two, not only was it because he was Black, it was also because he also wanted to dictate the terms under which this would happen, right? Three, there were a lot of other competing interests. I think this is what makes it resonant to today, is that Oklahoma might be seen as this place where dreams go to die. It's really where dreams go to collide. there are a lot of poor white immigrants who were being told the same thing that Black people were being told, the same thing that others were being told, rich people as well, that this could be the place for you to belong. You might not have belonged anywhere else, but here's the place. And so there were massive efforts to also paint McCabe as a Negro supremacist, as a scary boogeyman that might be
that he
there
was
to come and take us away.
anti-white, that it was more
Deeply.
than just creating. Was there evidence that he was?
You know, and to that end, right, he didn't help himself, right? Again, you want a guy who's really controversial. So he would say things like, I would like for this place to be a place where white people are tolerated at a minimum. He would say things like, we will have Negro state officers, Negro senators, Negro congressmen, Negro teachers, Negro lawyers, doctors. He would kind of list all of those people, but he would do so, yes, in many cases at the seeming exclusion of white people. And he thought that this quote unquote colonization scheme, the Negro colonization scheme of Oklahoma, would be one that would be enticing to white people who wanted to dispatch with the Black people that they had. But in actuality, he fed into some of the prior beliefs that he might be anti-white, when in actuality, you can't find too much of it.
What was the role of the Creek Nation in all of this? Were they allies with what he was doing? I'm leading you into this because I'm guessing your book about the Creek Nation and how many members of African descent were in it. I'm guessing these two stories collide in some way.
In many ways, it wasn't just the Creek Nation, but the Cherokee Nation and others had varying perspectives, right? I think it's really always important to remember that these aren't just racial categories, but these are nations. These are people with autonomous governing structures, borders, territories. And in many cases, in the case of the Cherokee Nation, there's a really crystal clear incident among many others in the book where there are, armed standoffs in the eastern portion of the Oklahoma Territory and the western part of Indian Territory, where Black people had been invited by seemingly Black Cherokee citizens to be a part of Oklahoma in the evolving kind of creation of what was going to become Oklahoma. And that was not seen as a welcome sign. You also had contemporaries of his, like Alex Posey and others, who were launching really nakedly racist attacks, not just on people like McCabe, but even at that time, their own principal chief, who was a darker skinned Black man. I mean, my complexion, for those who might see this on video, my complexion named Legis Perriman, who himself was a dark skinned Black citizen and chief of the Creek Nation. So there were a lot of competing factors where, again, that zero-sum politics we see today was very much at work then.
Is this basically all right, everybody wanted control. Everybody knows this is going to become a state and everybody wanted an old-fashioned just fight for control, right? Whether you can look at it through racial lens, you can look at it through just a power lens. Is this better to be looked at through a power lens?
Certainly. And then all of those things that intersect with it, right? Race, tribal affiliation and citizenship, money, economic power, most certainly all of that is interacting with who's going to be in charge, who's going to have more power. Because at the same time, these indigenous nations are also crafting their own constitution called the Sequoia Constitution, which they hope would be the invention of their own state called the Sequoia. So at the same time, there are a lot of these groups just vying for not just, I think, power, but like a place that would be theirs.
So he runs into this, I guess, would you call it a challenge for supremacy of the geographic region? I mean, and so when does he give up? What makes him give up? What makes him walk away?
There are so many things that make him give up and go away, but the very first law that Oklahoma passes, right? You can look at like the very first laws that Texas passes, Kansas, Arkansas, all these surrounding states, and they deal with some of the perfunctory kind of things that would make one fall asleep hearing about the details of, right? Because they're so foundational to how any given place would work. Oklahoma's very, very first law is a Jim Crow law, right? That's why I kind of write that Oklahoma, like much of the American West, just becomes the American South in the worst way. right? And it's the very, very first law. And I mean, in so doing, that plus the moving of the territory's capital to the ascendance of a lot of these members of the Oklahoma elite that end up also becoming members of the KKK in Oklahoma, up to state leadership, makes it abundantly clear, especially as Black people like his peers, A.C. Hamlin, are losing seats in office, that this isn't going to work for McCabe. And so he actually pours a lot of his last dollars trying to fight that law, this Jim Crow law,
So
all the way to the
let's
Supreme Court.
Are we in now the early 20th century? Because Oklahoma becomes a state in, I just double checked, 1907.
Mhm.
So when they become a state, what is McCabe's role in that?
Yeah. So, I mean, his role is increasingly diminishing, essentially just becoming an assistant auditor, a guy who's reading the minutes during kind of territorial congressional hearings. I mean, he's becoming just another dude with very, very little power and access to power.
So he makes this last stand. He basically loses and realizes not only is this not going to be a place for a Black state, it may not be a place for Black people.
That's definitely what he comes to the conclusion of, and says as much.
Where does he go?
So initially he tries to go with one of his old buddies to Canada for this colonization scheme of a portion of Canada, which is an incredibly short-lived endeavor and is a drastic failure on his part. And we end up finding McCabe much later on in Chicago, back to where he had some opportunities, of course, where there's a sizable Black population, and also where we see kind of the increase of Black population in Chicago due to the Great Migration. But it's not as if he's high on the horse. He is barely holding on.
What happened to his benefactors? It seemed like he had some benefactors from the North. What happened to them?
So a lot of them, a good chunk of them, as one can imagine, some of them were quite fictional in terms of their ties to him, right? We see that especially with like the Waldorfs. But
so you end up finding out some of this was just salesmanship, right?
Exactly. A lot of, boosterism, as one would call it. But for him also, a lot of his benefactors sometimes end up, especially as he gets later on in life, lampooning him, right? They end up saying, maybe he should have got some insurance. Maybe he should have had a career that would have benefited him beyond this. Some of the people who were in Oklahoma, Black people in Oklahoma, who chided his efforts before, kind of engaged in a game of I told you so. And a lot of those U.S. Senator relationships and congressional relationships that he had to kind of move on with the game of politicking. And McCabe didn't have a constituency that represented power. So to your point earlier, if this was really a question of power, McCabe had lost a lot of his power. And as such, he lost a lot of his relevance, even to some of his benefactors.
I'm obsessed with alternative histories, meaning, where if a fork in the road had been taken differently, how would the butterfly have flapped its wings? Have you, given all the research you've done, everything you've learned about this time period, what you know about American history as it is, what if he had succeeded? What if Benjamin Harrison had concluded, it's good politics for the Republican Party. We need to do this. Oklahoma's going to be essentially a Black state. We won't call it a Black state, but we're going to make sure it starts with Black leadership and all of this. And it comes to fruition. Where do we go? What does that look like? And what kind of impact does that have?
Sure. So I think a few things. One, it would have concentrated a certain degree of power in one place, right? Let's just take this thought.
And probably created more wealth creation too.
For sure, right? Yeah. Especially if you think about the fact that Oklahoma was just moments, right, away from running rich with Black gold, right?
Right.
Yes. In fact,
if they get the state in the late 19th century, and then all of a sudden those first, hey, what is this stuff that's making my hands all dirty? Oh,
Exactly.
yeah, yeah.
Exactly, right? But do I think the United States government would have kept its hands off and said, "Oh, go with
Right.
God, congratulations"? I don't think so. And I would imagine, there's always I always think about this political scientist Andrew Gillespie, who talks about the ways in which Black people sometimes, if they're in congressional districts where it's almost predominantly Black, right? What sort of power do they then have at a national level versus the diffusion of Black the Black population in a variety of areas? Would it force some of these other areas to contend with a much more diverse constituency?
We're having this debate today with redistricting. I mean, right?
Aren't we?
This goes back and forth all the time. And, in many ways, Black political leaders are put in this trap, if you
Exactly.
will. Right. And it is a trap. And what's good for electing more Black representatives may not be good overall for Black constituents.
Exactly. And I think that's what we would have probably seen in the case of Oklahoma. The only factor that two factors we have to consider is that, again, there were longstanding, recently disempowered and disenfranchised indigenous nations that had many claims to the land. And on top of that, that land would, in just a short amount of time, become the site of making some of the richest Americans at that moment in time as well. So those two factors are the things I always think about when I pore over this research.
How much is this connected with the development of Tulsa as Black Wall Street?
Yeah, so this is a question I get pretty frequently on tour, and the best way that I can answer it is that the work of McCabe was primarily to the west of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But part of it also is that in dating back to 1890, right, one of the first real censuses that really encompass a lot more Black people, right? The conductors of that census then kind of look and gaze upon the eastern part of Oklahoma and say, this is the best place in the world for Black people. Because a lot of these people, Creek and Cherokee citizens, Seminole, had already created these much more unique and inclusive ways of being a citizen and participating in their practice. And so as such, that's what we see really emerge as the igniting fuel for Tulsa's Black Wall Street. That's where we kind of see a lot of it come together. That's not to say, though, that the work of McCabe and so many other Black people who people will meet in this book to really try and make this part of the country, both territories, Indian Territory and Oklahoma Territory, a hospitable place for Black people. So to some extent, it's part of this larger goal of creating a safe haven for Black people at that precise time when it seemed as if there was nowhere that would be safe for Black people.
So the massacre in Tulsa sort of then upends that idea that this is a safe haven.
That's a really nice way of putting it. Yes. And on top of that, it's one thing for the massacre to happen, but what happens immediately following it is that the mayor of Tulsa, T.D. Evans, at that time articulates kind of the real goal here. He says, well, just let the Negro be placed further north and east, right? Which goes back to kind of what we're seeing in this book is that let's just find another place where they're not our problem any longer. Right?
This is, why did Black people go to Oklahoma? Because somebody else was trying to push them away. I mean, this is the story of Black Americans.
Certainly, without question. And so that's what drew me to this story is that it was a guy pushing against the current of history, right? Saying that perhaps if I can get this just right from a political tactician's perspective, maybe I can win against the crushing wave of history.
The cross-pollination, the interaction with the tribes is fascinating to me because to this day, the Cherokee Nation in particular has some political power in Oklahoma. And in some ways, I've been fascinated by this, the structure of political fights in Oklahoma now, which is it's no longer R versus D. It is Republicans versus the tribes. And sometimes the tribal money people are behind a Republican primary opponent. Sometimes they decide to fund a Democrat who's a former Republican. But it really feels like, and I always say, politics abhors a vacuum. It's not always filled by the same name of the opposition that we have in other places, if it's an R or D. Sometimes it's this. And in some of these single party states like Oklahoma that have a very wealthy tribal, I guess, tribal derivative nations, right? The nations they exist, but they don't necessarily have the same power that they once had, but they certainly have wealth now. Right. And that wealth, we all know money drives politics more than anything else.
Certainly.
I'm curious of your observation of that. Am I describing that correctly? Am I being a little too sort of, I don't know, looking at making it too clean of a division?
Yeah. And look, I think that what's very clear is that Oklahoma has become one of the top gambling states, right? In the entire country. And a lot of that is very much, yes, and should be controlled by those indigenous nations, which have been so kind of treated unfairly is the kindest way that I can put it, right? That they've been so horribly treated that a lot of times that money, when reinvested into the community, which it is.
Look, let's call it what it is. It's sort of the only reparation Native Americans got.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. And so it's a veritable drop in the bucket. But to your point, the tensions politically, I think you actually started to really describe it pretty well. Is that, you have people like Oklahoma's governor, I don't live there anymore, but Oklahoma's governor, Kevin Stitt, who is, has found himself crosswise with various nations, in part because he wants to increase what's called like the compact fee, which is like the tax.
He just wants more money. That's right.
Exactly.
By the way, every problem is usually about money, and every solution is usually money.
Certainly. And even in the most recent Supreme Court case, where of all people are, Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch sides with.
Amazing, right? Like what? In fact, who does Oklahoma belong to today? Do you know?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of legal and criminal jurisdictional questions, a lot of the eastern portion of Oklahoma still, according to our Supreme Court, love them or hate them, belongs to the Muskogee Creek Nation, right?
Yeah.
And that reifying that kind of the fact that those treaties are still good law, it has not been abrogated, really pisses off, yes, a lot of people like Kevin Stitt and others who want, as you mentioned earlier, to have not just more money, but money by way of power, right? And so as such, the example of Oklahoma, as I always tell people, is another way of understanding kind of our country, because Oklahoma has always been this near laboratory for many peoples, poor white immigrants, white laborers, indigenous peoples, Black people, to try and figure out for themselves, without much support and lots of antagonism, a way to exist together and belong in this country.
It's so what you just described there. I mean, you're right. Like you just invoked Grapes of Wrath, the Dust Bowl. I mean, it is literally now, as we now see the map of the United States, it turned into a crossroads state, didn't it?
Certainly. I mean, not just figuratively, but literally with Route 66, which is kind of one of our pride and glory. It is. But at the same time, I think we still try and kind of consolidate it along with a lot of other places that have a lot of deep meaning as just part of flyover country, right? Not meant to be considered or studied.
I'd love to dig in more. What is your there's a lot of what I'd call sort of, history that wasn't written about. I just in my own travels discovered the story of Blanche Bruce. As I was digging into more about Garfield. I'm obsessed with Garfield in a whole number of ways. I've got this Pollyannish view that if Garfield lives, Reconstruction might have come back. Maybe that we might have, imagine if this essentially the Civil Rights Act of 1965 is actually passed in 1883, right? And signed into law by President Garfield. Where are we, as a country today, if essentially everything happens 80 years sooner when it comes to civil rights? And this whole period in the story of Blanche Bruce is fascinating. I discovered this, found this book that somebody wrote about the first Black political dynasty.
Yes.
So I throw that out there in that, I'm a hungry history junkie. I think the people that choose to listen to my podcast sort of share a little bit of that. What are some stories do you think more, what are you diving into? What's a couple of stories you're writing about now? I guess it's my elaborate way of asking what's next, or what are some other underwritten histories that you think need some historical work? And, you're busy doing one thing, and if, you can't clone yourself and you wish you could dive in there. Yeah.
For sure. Yes. I mean, I think that the book you were referencing is written by Lawrence Otis Graham about both Blanche Bruce and his wife. But the sort of work that I'm really quite captivated by always, I mean, there's so much work to do even just within that kind of corridor of the Midwest, Southwest, that it is too long to list. But what I'm working on a lot right now, and I'm just meeting with my agent in about 45 minutes, so let's see if he agrees. But I'm spending a lot of my time thinking more about the question of power and belonging and wealth. And so there's never really been a kind of canonical book that tells in a narrative form the story of the racial wealth gap. We oftentimes see snapshots. In the case of, say, The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, beautiful, gracious, just wonderful book, covers roughly about 50 to 60 years of time. Whereas for me, I think that the story is a lot more complicated than that, much more interesting than that. And I think I've found a family that Black and white, dating back to about the 1600s, who actually can both illustrate but then also show their own influence on the construction of the racial wealth gap, dating back to the 1600s. So that to me is where I'm spending a lot of my time, in their stories, in their archives, seeing them fight back and have family dramas and whatnot, politicking almost within their own families. And then I'm also kind of examining what does Black ambition look like for someone who was also known as Black Moses. So that's Marcus Garvey. And in part because the efforts to thwart him were led by a Black man in partnership with J. Edgar Hoover, and how that might have been the setup for COINTELPRO decades before COINTELPRO went into practice. And so I'm spending my time on both of those right now, because I think they give us a keyhole into the America that we have right now, dating back to actions and decisions made, in the case of the first book, hundreds of years ago, and the other one about 100 years ago.
The issue of the Black wealth gap, and sort of, there was the show Gilded Age was popular in my household, and we've loved it. I find the show where it actually, there's a lot of way, as I said, there's a lot of ways in culturally into this story, no matter, of your own, no matter your ethnicity, your religion, all this stuff. It's fascinating. And they really think this last season, they've done a really good job of sort of painting the complicated history of America. Where would you identify that crossroads? Because what, they got at, and the Blanche Bruce book gets at this too, that there was this divide between sort of the free Black elites of the North and the so-called, newly free Black Americans of the South wanting to pursue their own American dream.
Without question. And I think you see some of that even in Black Moses, because McCabe was effectively, right? He went to boarding school in Newport, where
did that give him more credibility, or did that actually turn off some Blacks in Oklahoma?
It's a good question. Credibility with whom, right? Did it give him a lot of credibility with his white peers? Sure, right? Of course. Did it give him, did it kind of give rise to people like this Black man named John Paul Jones in Norman, Oklahoma, who thought he was a Sadidi, his words, carpetbagger, his words? Yes, I'm sure it did. But I think that what we see is that division is, I mean, first of all, it's the most fascinating kind of under-discussed, under-reported,
Right.
underwritten thing that I think it exists. But that division that Larry Graham in his book tries to dive into and the Gilded Age really kind of exploits is manifest all over, kind of, especially the late 19th century all the way through till now, right? In terms of whose people are you? Where did you come from? What was your origin? What was your who were your people? Effectively, is a really potent question that we see asked and answered even in the Gilded Age.
Well, this gets at the core of what is America, right? The whole point, we like to believe that we broke away so that wasn't a determinative factor for your future, that it didn't depend on your bloodlines. Were you from the feudal side of the world in Europe, or were you from a monarch, whatever, some frankly probably derivative of a Roman Empire general who just had to controlled turf and then called themselves king, right?
Of course.
But so the whole point of America was to like break this idea of an aristocracy, of an elite, and yet what has been the constant theme of, frankly, the development of America has been these fights between those who say, hey, your lineage matters, and those that say, no, your freedom matters.
Certainly, right. And it's sad that those two things almost stand in opposition to one another, your freedom and your kind of lineage, when in actuality, it should be that both can exist on the same plane, that in fact, this is my lineage, and yet I am free, and I am part of this American experience. And sadly, again, I think because we've made, the point I made in my first book, is that identity has become so rigid, and oftentimes is much more of an emptying out factor, as opposed to kind of a rich tapestry that we're constantly adding to. And I think, as I make in my second book, we place a cap on what people ought to be able to achieve. That in many cases we place kind of lineage and background and history and the diversity, rich, beautiful complexity that's associated with it, with the complexities and hard-won freedoms that we should be all enjoying at the same time in all of the different ways.
Every historian, when they write their history, is usually influenced by the current political climate. You can't help it, and it's, just because, interpretation is always done through your own experiences. How do you check yourself on that when you're writing, and how much do you want it included in your analysis and interpretation? And because the reader is reading it through the lens of their own experiences and then trying to fit it in to what they think they already knew, which I think, it's to me what makes reading history, in many ways, I want to know a lot more about the author, because that will tell me just, what the intellectual bias is going to be going into the prose.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, there are many ways that I fight it. In tactile terms, I have a community of people who read my stuff before it ever gets anywhere near someone such as yourself. But I think in a way that's maybe a little less tactile, I really spend a lot of my time reading what those folks perhaps at that time were reading, right?
That's an interesting thing. Tell me, I'm gonna, now you got me off. And I want to keep you under an hour here, and we've been going about 45 minutes. But I find that to be the most when I talk about today's media climate, I say, it's very partisan. It's actually a very familiar media climate to historians, because in the 19th century, whenever I've dug in, I told you about Garfield, I went deep and learning more about Garfield, and every news story had 4 points of view. And I'd say that because especially if it was in Washington, D.C., because you had black newspaper archives, and that was from the black press. You'd have the Republican Party press, you had Democratic Party press, and you had even at times Whig press or some other. So there was always, and other than the event itself being familiar, there would be different interpretations. How did you, when your source material, how did you handle that, knowing that there was probably bias written into that source material?
Certainly. I mean, I the best way to answer it is that, as folks will see in the very end of the book, I we took font size to probably beyond its limit. Otherwise, the sources pages would have been larger than the book itself.
Yeah, which you do see in some history books. You're like, oh, it's overwhelming. Don't worry. Literally half of it is the bibliography, right? Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, I think my answer is to go even further, right? So if we're looking at a senator at that time, Senator Preston Plum from Kansas, right?
Yeah.
Or someone of that nature, I'm not just going to look at, the Washington Bee and perhaps what the other kind of Republican, Democrat, et cetera, pages. I'm also going to go to their local pages. I'm going to go to the neighboring towns that Senator Preston Plum is from. I'm going to kind of look at this massive kind of collection. So for each character in the cast of characters in my book, there's almost this orbit of satellites, and those satellites contain just troves of information about how did so many different people see this person, right? And there's a person who is he's my favorite person to dislike in all of American history, which is Senator Daniel Voorhees, who features prominently in this book, where he decides to have this massive Senate hearing, which is all cockamamie and what most people would call BS, and what the New York Times called BS, and his local paper called BS, and everyone else. So like part of the reason it's so I really love to dislike him is because no one had anything good to say about him.
Everybody seemed to dislike him. Didn't matter.
Everyone hated him. Yeah. And so to some extent, I think, nerd to nerd, I really enjoyed kind of developing as wide and as vast and as deep of an understanding of each person who I spent any time writing about.
Well, I think the hardest part of doing this work is not to get caught in rabbit holes. You must find stuff that are like, what a great story. Has nothing to do with what I'm researching, but wow, what a great story, right? Like that's
certainly. And my office is full of the pages that my editor said, these are really interesting stories, but they'll never see the light of day.
So, are you comfortable being an historian the rest of your life, or do you miss day-to-day news, day-to-day, would you like to be covering the present day more, or what's your ambition going forward? What do you want to be doing in the next 10 years?
What do I want to be doing in the next 10 years? So I think that my answer to that is, I find that without engaging in presentism, which is like every historian's nightmare of a debate, I think there's something useful about adding context to the current moment, right? And I think that's why you can say, as you said earlier, that, you think newspaper media is partisan now? Take a look at how it used to be and what the implications were and what the sacrifices were. What were the costs of doing so? So to me, I see myself as wanting to write these iconic American stories. And I feel as if McCabe is such his story is so quintessentially American, right? And so I think over the coming decade, I'll be doing even more of that, but at an even larger scale, trying to bite, if not swallow, larger and larger bites of the apple, if you will.
Well, I look forward to it, Caleb. I mean, I just, I'm reminded all the time that we talk about, my daughter's studying marine biology, and, the ocean is, we've only discovered, we've probably explored space more than we've explored the oceans, and we've only discovered so little about our system. And I think about that in American history. I think we only know about 10% of the story of American history, I think.
I agree. I think that the phrase is, what is it? The old seaman's prayer, which is, God, your ocean is so vast, but my boat is so small. Yeah. And so to some extent, to extend your daughter's metaphor that much more, I just feel as if I'm just getting started.
I feel this way all the time. So thanks to your book, I now feel like I know 11% of American history.
Thank you.
Caleb, it's really good to meet you. Appreciate you spending some time with us.
Chuck, it means so much.